I'm Féidhlim Harty. I'm an environmental consultant and waterway rewilder. I'm a writer, so couple of strings in there. I used to do reed bed design, and kind of have pivoted away from that in the last 5 years because there's suddenly funding for working with landscape repair rather than just repairing some of the damage of lifestyle habits and that kind of stuff. So I want to introduce you to a couple of species that are hugely important to waterways and to the EPA and their monitoring processes. So the top one is a water snail, and the lower two are both different species of cased caddisflies. And the reason why I'm introducing you to these three is because basically the EPA essentially have a program of monitoring water quality around the country by carrying out what's called kick sampling. So what they do essentially is they go out and interview these lads. So they step into a watercourse every 4 years and find these species and essentially interview them and ask them about the water quality. I'll explain kind of how that works. Basically, the top one, we'll look at the bottom one first. Insects breathe through their abdomens. So when you build a house around your abdomen for protection, like the cased caddisfly does, the dissolved oxygen in the water moves in through the house and through the abdomen quite slowly. So you need good high oxygen levels in the water in order for the cased caddisfly to be able to breathe and thus to be able to survive in that watercourse. So if you've got pollution, your dissolved oxygen levels begin to fall and you won't find your cased caddisfly at all. So if the EPA monitor a waterway and they find that there's none of those species, then they know that they're not high quality, not good quality. You're down into the lower reaches of the quality status bars, if you like. And the top one is a water snail that's much more tolerant of pollution, but not completely tolerant. So if your water snail is there, it means that it's not in the very bottom rung, if you like, in terms of water quality. So this map is an overview of the water quality around the country based on that basically interview process, if you like. So what the EPA do is each one of these dots is a sampling point. Somebody from the EPA will jump into the river or the stream, kick around in the gravel, just up gradient from a net. The insects and the other species will wash into the net, and then you tip everything out into a white tray, count them all, identify the species level, and that gives you a really, really good overview of the long-term health of the watercourse. So the blue dots all around the place are high status waters, Q5, green dots are Q4, the yellow are Q3. I'm having difficulty counting backwards from 5. That's a bad sign at this stage in the talk. And then the orange are Q2. And there's the odd red dot around the place, which is Q1, which is seriously polluted. But basically what we can see, if you look very briefly at this is a very general overview. What does that map tell you? And I actually want you to shout the answer back to me because I'm not going to tell you. You're not shouting very loud. What's that? Up Mayo, exactly. The uplands in Mayo and the uplands in Wicklow and West Cork and Kerry and Donegal, the upland areas where you don't have housing, you don't have people, and you don't have a lot of livestock. Those are the areas where the water quality tends to be best. As soon as you get down into areas around cities, townlands, into good farming land, or areas where there's high stocking densities, etc., your water quality begins to deteriorate. So you can see a really clear correlation there between land use and water quality. So if we zoom in here into Kerry, we can see that there's blue status, there's high status waters in the south of the county, a lot of green, bits of orange, bits of yellow. This is from the EPA catchments map, catchments.ie, and it's a really useful resource just to zoom in on your own area and turn on and off the different GIS layers to be able to see what's happening within the watercourse. So let's look for a moment. Do I have a pointer on this? Can you see the pointer at all? Yeah, okay. So you can see from the late 1980s, we had 91 seriously polluted rivers and streams, and that's fallen steadily year on year, pretty much. A little bit of an increase again. I think as soon as quotas were lifted, that correlated with an increase in serious pollution again. Correlation doesn't equal causation, but they look kind of suspicious, So we can see that there's a steady drop in serious pollution. That's a really good thing from a watercourse point of view. More troubling is that we've almost halved the number of high status waters around the country in the same time. So basically what we've got, actually I'll zip onto this one quickly. because there's also a reference. If you look within the blue status waters, there's a subset of that called reference quality. And reference quality is basically water that hasn't known pollution. Okay? And you can see here we had 13.4% reference quality waters in the late 1980s, and that's dipping over the last decade and a half, down around 1%. So what that looks like basically is a bulldozing program for habitats that's suitable for insects with no rebuilding program. Does that make sense? I mean, it obviously doesn't make sense, but you understand what I'm saying nonetheless. And so basically what we're doing is we're just edging species out steadily and gradually. I mean, the only natural outcome of that process is extinction of those species, inevitably. And so what I want to look at is how do we repair that damage? That's the depressing bit done, okay? So we can just say, okay, depressing bit is done. We'll just scratch it out of our minds. We'll put it on the compost heap and let it grow some new ideas, okay? Because we want to move beyond that. I've gave that a little bit too early, because this is a study. We're not just looking at aquatic insects. We're also looking at terrestrial insects as well. This is a study in Germany. And if we look at July for a second, there's over 900 grams of insects collected in a particular sample for the study in 1989. That had dropped to about 160 grams in 2013. So we're seeing right around the world, we're seeing these plummeting numbers in insect biomass around the world. And we're seeing something similar in bird life. We're seeing it similar in mammals. Basically, all wild species are suffering hugely. And if you imagine that insects are the basis for the food chain for so many other things, you can see that if the insects suffer, everything else is going to suffer as well. And so you can see it very clearly on your windshields. You know, driving around a generation ago, you'd come home with a load of windscreen insect splatter, and that just doesn't happen anymore. And that's just a function of the number of insects just gone from the landscape. So how do we know if our water is clean? Well, there's a couple of things that we can look at. First of all, look at the water itself. If it's nice and clear, that's obviously a good sign. And then you look at the substrate. If the substrate is nice and clear and stony and free of scum and furring, that's also a very good sign. So this would be a kind of a typical clean stream bed appearance. Not so clean, not quite as clean. One of the big issues that we see in this particular example is suspended solids. Now, suspended solids doesn't need to look as dramatic as this. This is a small stream in Cloyne, close to where I grew up. Suspended solids can come from sewage sludge, from slurry, from soil washing off the land. There's a lot from post-forestry clear-out, for example. There's a lot of potential sources, and even in very small amounts, they can clog up spawning beds. They can make it tricky for fish to see, for feeding, and they can also completely clog up pearl mussel beds. And you wipe out an entire species that's been there for centuries. And so suspended solids can be a big issue within waterways. Nitrates and phosphates coming off of septic tank effluent, municipal effluents, slurry, fertilizers, those cause a huge problem. They're basically fertilizers. That's all they are. They produce lots and lots of plants. If those plants are algae in the water, that can be a big problem for lots of other species within the waterways. And so the other one that I want to look at briefly, the one tricky term is BOD, biochemical oxygen demand. Just out of curiosity, who's familiar with the term? Show of hands. A couple of people? Okay. It sounds kind of big and awkward and unwieldy. The biochemical oxygen demand. It's the biological and chemical processes that exert a draw of oxygen out of the water, essentially. It's basically a measure of the food value for microbes. So when you've got pollution coming into clean water, the higher the food value for the microbes, the more BOD you get. What we're looking at here is a filamentous bacteria. It's called sewage fungus, confusingly. So the sewage fungus will grow in areas where the BOD loading is high enough, where there's enough food value basically for them. And so what you see is a pink or a white or a grey scum on the water. And so it's not that the filamentous bacteria are a problem. In fact, they're part of the solution. It's that they're an indicator of the fact that there's pollution getting into the watercourse. So this is a small stream in East Clare, just downstream from some septic tanks. And this photograph was taken while we were building a new wetland in order to clean up the water. So it's not a doom and gloom story on that photograph per se. It's just a teaching tool around BOD. And the other thing, of course, is moving away from slurry and septic tank effluents and looking at stormwater. This was a photograph during a rain shower near the lakes of Killarney. And heavy rainfall on roads will wash off silt, grit, petrol, diesel, oil, microplastics from tyres. About 50% of the microplastics in our waters come from tyres. And so if that runs off into rivers and streams, it can obviously be a big problem for the watercourses. This is a storm sewer diverter. We're moving kind of quickly, just looking at a general overview of some of the challenges, and we'll move beyond that again in a moment and look at the solutions, which is where the fun is. This is a storm sewer diverter, and hands up who has never heard of a storm sewer diverter. Okay, that's too many of you. Hands up who has ever heard of the fact that beaches get closed in the summer after a rain shower. Okay. I wonder what the connection might be. So basically, when there's heavy rainfall, particularly in the summer, because the summer tends to be when people go swimming, and also when the towns and villages around seaside areas are actually full of holidaymakers as well, what happens is that during the normal run of events in dry weather, the sewage from the town flows in the first pipe, and it flows out the small pipe at the base at the far end. Okay? And it goes into the septic tank or the sewage treatment system or whatever it is. And that's grand. Now, if there's a heavy rain shower, in a lot of urban areas, there's historic drainage that has both gutters and sewers going into the same pipes, at least to some degree. So what happens is that when there's heavy rain showers, in order to protect the septic tank from a huge gush of rainwater flowing through it, there's this really nifty and not terribly beautiful device. And what that does is it restricts the flow into the septic tank. But the drawback is that, see the higher pipe there? The higher pipe goes straight into the beach or into the river or the stream or whatever it is. And so when there's heavy rainfall, after a certain amount of time, that tank will fill up because the septic tank can't take it anymore, and everything that gets flushed down a toilet will go straight into the watercourse, and hence your beach notice. And so I won't mention all of the other things that are very, very clear indicators of that event that are floating in the water just beyond the beach notice. So that's your storm sewer diverter. Now, there is a point to all of this background, and I'll get to that in a moment. First, I want to look at habitat removal. So this is a small boggy corner in East Cork where I used to harvest wetland plants when I started doing reed beds in the mid-1990s. And I used to go in on this quaking bog. When I jump up and down, the whole ground will ripple. So the one rule I had was carry my spade that way, so that if I go down through the bog, at least the spade catches on the ground. So I'd harvest my bulrush and sell them, and they were used all around Munster and all around the country for reed bed filter systems. That has since been removed. It's been turned into a private garden for somebody's home, and that's a fairly common state of affairs. Over the last 50 years, we've seen a steady continuation, really, because it was nothing new, but a steady continuation of landscape change by basically removing habitat and creating farmland or land that's available for production. As speakers were saying already this morning, since the 1950s, the general agricultural policy has been to try to keep as much productive land, so-called, open for agriculture as possible. And what that has meant is that farmers were basically penalised for having habitat on their land. If there's too much habitat, you don't get paid your area payments. And so that's a large part behind the steady shift towards denuding the landscape of habitat. The challenge for water is that when you take out bogs and boggy corners and wet, puddly, marshy areas at the bottom of fields, when you take out ancient woodlands, even when you remove ancient grasslands, when you remove old hedgerows, particularly hedgerows planted on contours, every time you take out those habitats, what you're doing is you're removing a sponge from the landscape. So when there's heavy rainfall, that rain has nowhere to go. So it lands on the ground, goes into the nearest drain, into the nearest ditch, and away off down into the nearest river. And I mean, we've seen the impact of that. This is a photograph, if I can get it to work. Whoops, daisy. This is a photograph of Middleton, where I grew up. And that's not your average Saturday afternoon, obviously. It's a little bit wetter than that. There was about 4 inches of rain fell on the Onacurra catchment just last October, November, and just flooded straight down through Main Street. I would argue that that's less to do with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and general warming, and much, much more to do with land management and landscape management. And I'll talk about that a bit more later, but all of these issues are really interconnected. Because when we think of climate change, we think of all manner of things. Flooding and droughts are two very typical ones, and they're a direct function of how we manage the land and how we manage the soil and how we farm. And the flip side of that, of course, is the droughts. And I did specifically go and ask the insects in the stream what they thought of the drought, because there was nobody that was complaining about the drought. Nobody was fussed because nobody's living room was flooded, but the insects were not happy. Just to let you know, just in case anybody's in any doubt. So that's the flip side of the flooding, which is equally problematic. So the main issues, so we've got farm inputs, sewage inputs, urban runoff, forestry as well. Physical obstacles, just weirs, whether they're historic or new or in use or not. Weirs just act as a fish barrier or an insect barrier within the waterways. But arguably the largest impact is from land use policy. How we reward the landowners, basically, for how they manage land. And that's been towards a steady erosion of habitat within the landscape generally. Have you heard of shifting baseline syndrome? We think that the world should look the way the world was when we were kids. Of course, our parents think that the world should look the way it was when they were kids, and our grandparents think that the world should look the way it was when they were kids. For example, fish sizes are getting smaller and smaller each year, each time they return to rivers and streams. So what somebody is delighted with now as a prize catch is a lot smaller than it was a generation ago, which is smaller than it was a generation ago. And so we've become used to a really incredibly denuded landscape without the wildlife that we expect, without the birdsong, without the animals. And then we think that any moves towards rewilding become very threatening because they threaten to increase the flight of people from the land. But maybe it's not the wildlife itself that we're running from, maybe it's something more. So fortunately, there are an abundance of solutions. Bill Mollison, one of the co-founders of permaculture, he's got a lovely quote: "We're surrounded by insurmountable opportunities. Everywhere we look, there are opportunities for solutions." So first of all, just simply turn sewage pollution into fertilizer. It's a bit of a no-brainer. When we've got too much nitrates and phosphates, turn it into plants. This is an industrial effluent in the Midlands. This is a small stream in East Cork. We just widen it out, and all of a sudden you've got an area that can trap silt, can mop up nitrates and phosphates, clean up the water, reduce the BOD, because wetland plants have evolved over millennia to grow in nutrient-rich saturated environments, and so they're ideally suited for use as filter plants for dealing with dirty water. They absolutely love it. This is scum on the surface of a constructed wetland sewage treatment system, and the bacteria produce the scum, and then as the bacteria move through the system, the plants act as a filter to filter that out. So basically what we're doing with reed beds and wetland systems is we're building a creche for microbes. That's all we're doing, essentially doing that. There is, oops, daisy, that was way too noisy. There is an uptake of nitrates and phosphates, but basically it's the BOD load that we're trying to address, and that's done by building this creche for microbes. And so the more we can support microbes within that environment, the better. So this is a standard domestic scale gravel reed bed system just on the day of planting. And as the water passes through, the plants mop up the nutrients, and they also provide this creche for microbes underneath the surface of the gravel. Because wetland plants have evolved in saturated soils, they've got this ability to draw oxygen down through the stems where it becomes available at the root zone for supporting microbes. So it's a really effective way to introduce oxygen. So in conventional sewage, you use lots of electricity and concrete and steel tanks and all that to bring in that oxygen, whereas here we use lots and lots and lots of individual wetland plants. This is a soil-based constructed wetland with a pond in it in East Cork. And again, it's the same mechanisms, only in this system it's almost more natural again. You don't have your gravel in there. This is a system that I prefer even more. This is a willow system. And what the willow system does is it mops up not only lots and lots of the liquid, but it takes up huge quantities of nitrates and phosphates. So you can imagine if the uptake of nutrients is a function of the above ground growth, just the sheer volume of growth here, you can see from that how much nutrient needs to be taken up from the soil. And what I'd love to do is to modify all of the pipe layout in every failed septic tank around the country. Change the pipe layout so that it can't clog with the willow roots, and then plant your willow plantation over the top of it, and then cut that for chips for burning by the ESB in Eatonderry, or leave it for a longer coppice cycle and use it for firewood. There's lots and lots of ways that we could utilize existing sewage pollution just to grow firewood and wood chips. And I was listening to a soil scientist 2 weeks ago, and just in conversation with her, she was saying that chipped willow wood spread on farmland at very, very small densities can be an amazing way to act as a seed source for fungi. So you've got the carbon source in the field, and the fungi will come along naturally and begin to grow on that, and that can begin to reintroduce the fungi back into our farmland again. One of the challenges with that is that we've been using nitrogen fertilizers for many years, and when the nitrogen fertilizer goes on the land, the fungi that's already naturally in the soil said, well, okay, the nutrients are being provided anyway, I'm out of a job. And so the nitrogen fertilizer pushes the fungi out. And willow wood chips and whitewood wood chips generally are a way to bring back in the fungal growth within the soil itself. This is the sewage treatment system in Kilchima in Mayo. You can see the constructed wetland here, the standard secondary treatment system here. Now, when anybody flushes a toilet in Kilchima, it goes down for very good treatment here and even better treatment here before getting into the Moy River catchment. Now, when it rains, all of the rainfall from the roof surfaces, the streets, and then whatever goes into that, whether it's dog fouling or pigeon droppings or spilled milk or whatever it is, that all washes down into the constructed wetland as well. And what I love about this system is when there's a storm surge and there's a downpour, to the degree that the sewers in the village are still combined in some areas, the overflow gets dumped straight into the constructed wetland rather than into the river. And that's another system that I'd love to roll out in every town and village around the country. Now, all of what I looked at are kind of end-of-pipe technologies. They're a way to deal with sewage. Another way to deal with the nutrients and the biomass that are present is to use, for example, urine-diverting toilets, and we can capture the urine from that for use as a nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer source. This is an aquatron, if I can get my pointer to work. This is an aquatron separator, so we can capture the carbon, the compost, the nutrients, the humus, and begin to make compost out of human urine rather than just sending it down into sewage sludge, where it mixes with the grey water chemicals and becomes toxic. If there's any publicans or hoteliers left in the audience, I have a great business model. You sell your clientele liquid twice. Basically, particularly in farming communities, you sell them beer first or wine, and then you let them go to the loo, keep the urine, and sell it back as a fertilizer. So it's there. That's your new business model for anybody willing to do that. And this is just a compost toilet at a site in France. Another compost toilets are a really, really effective way to capture human urine and the nutrients in human waste, turn it into something useful. So step 2, basically wherever you've got urban runoff, use that as an excuse for creating biodiversity gardens. There's lots and lots of different SUD systems, sustainable or sustained urban drainage systems, and the ones highlighted in green are the ones that I particularly like. Can you read that, by the way, at the back? You can, most of you? Okay, so whether it's green roofs or rain harvesting, stormwater ponds, infiltration basins, these are all of the green ones, except for the rainwater harvesting actually, which is really useful, eco-friendly and all that, and you get your use out of it, but it doesn't have plants associated with it. All of the other ones highlighted in green, you can actively use as a biodiversity magnet, for creating wetland spaces, as filters for the stormwater runoff, and also creating spaces for wildlife to come into your urban areas. So the first thing to remember is that when you've got stormwater, when you've got urban areas, as soon as you put water into a pipe, you've kind of lost the opportunity. It certainly can't get any cleaner. It can get from A to B more quickly. So it's a way to get it from your street to your river faster. That's about all. What you lose is the filtering capacity, the settlement and sedimentation capacities, the nutrient uptake, and the potential for biodiversity. And this is a couple of pipes in Middleton from a housing estate, and it's just run off from the street. And basically what you can see is where we've left it by design, we've left an open area between the pipes and a new stormwater wetland. What we've done is simply left it open. And you can see already, just within, I'd say, months of having built the housing estate, there's silt settling out, grit settling out, there's watercress beginning to grow, that's beginning to push in and pulling up nutrients, a little bit of algae growing at the far right, that's taking up more nutrients, then the plants will filter that out further. So just taking water out of pipes is a really easy and really effective way to start. This is a stormwater wetland in UL. It's taking that pipe idea to a slightly bigger level. It's widening the area out, holding onto the water and intentionally turning it into a stormwater wetland. And this is a habitat for a family of ducks, so it's a haven for wildlife as well. This is a stormwater filter wetland just on the bypass in Ennis. Again, it's all exactly the same mechanisms. So the same methodologies that you'd have within a sewage treatment wetland will all be active in constructed wetlands. You've seen the motorways. There's what's called a treatment train in SUD's terminology. So for sustained urban drainage systems, you want to have a number of different things going on. So here we can see two of them. The first one is the grass plot. So you've simply just got a very gently graded grass filter that will take the road runoff, the motorway runoff, this is the Ruski bypass, and filter that as it moves along into your wet swale. And then this is the swale on the day that we planted it, and that will flow down into a stormwater wetland and away. And so it's really, really simple. Like, these aren't complicated things, and yet what they can do is hold on to the hydrocarbons and also hold on to the microplastics that are in the water. As a community event, we did some work in North Cork, and this crew of FOSS workers at the time, we simply took a channel that was flowing along, an open drain flowing along beside the road, and by that afternoon we had a series of pocket pools all the way down along the slope between the road and the river. Very, very simple methods, planted up with yellow flag iris, which was spread and become thicker and beautiful and great for pollinators and water filtration. So these are some other examples. This is a stormwater wetland in Ennis, one in UL again, that's the Middleton one. This is my elder daughter, Susie. And Susie's jumping up and down on top of half a tree trunk. This is the main cycle route to school in Denmark, in the village where we were staying a number of years back. I love the Danish approach to health and safety. You know, they're the ones who developed the junkyard playgrounds as well, which are great and kind of self-explanatory. So here we have a raised rain garden planter. I heard recently, there was a talk in Ennis Diamond where I live now, and somebody was saying that after half an hour, you see the contents of the toilet float. After half an hour of heavy rainfall, so that's when you get rainfall getting into the sewage system as well, you see the contents of the toilets floating down the river. So that's the length of time it takes for the storm flow diverter to become effective. Does that make sense? And so what this does is it basically takes the rainfall downpipes from your gutter and it holds onto it for a few minutes. And I wonder, I don't know what the times are, but if every downpipe in Ennis Diamond had one of those, then it's possible that half-hour interval would push out to 3/4 of an hour. So instead of having, say, 20 very, very heavy half-hour events in a year, you might have only 5 3/4 of an hour events in the year. Does that make sense? And so just from having those rain planters, that can be a really effective way to stop your storm diverter coming into effect and dumping all the toilet contents straight into the river. These are cheaper versions of the same thing. You just pipe it straight into a low depression within the garden or in your curbs in your street, take out one car park space and drop in a gravel area and plant that up with wetland plants. They're really, really effective ways just to filter stormwater wetland where it exists. Because naturally, after many years of paving over wetland habitats and paving over farmland and everything to make urban areas, it's actually remarkably difficult to roll back on that and convince people to give up perfectly good tarred area to make a wetland. But it's happening increasingly, and one way to do it is to smuggle it into a single car park space. Or take, for example, in Geeshill in County Offaly, they've taken a community car park area and they've routed that through a very small swale. That goes into a stormwater wetland, which is just here, a little rain garden area that's just on the day of planting, hence the sparse-looking plants, and then into their new community pond. So there's ways to incorporate it into the park areas that are beautiful as well as everything else. Now, so here's our rain garden. On to the next slide. Okay. Did you see that actually? So the water goes into the rainwater butt for preference, and then into the planter after that, and then away. So make farming into the greatest ally of positive ecological change. There are so many ways that we could completely transform farming from being net problematic to being net beneficial for the environment. One way is to stop that, is to stop importing beef nuts from the Amazon. You know, it's a bit of a no-brainer. You know, we've got the best grass in the world. Let's practice regenerative farming so that we can begin to rebuild the soil. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. These are just different ways to put in buffer zones, to put in habitat reestatement, to change farming practices, build dams within the landscape to hold on to water. All of these mechanisms, it's the same basic idea. How do we slow down the flow, and how do we maximize the number of plants in our area? And I won't even talk about Pontbrain and Pickering, but if you're interested, look up Pontbrain and Pickering and see what you find. The runoff from farms, the BOD loading of raw sewage is 300 milligrams per litre. Okay, I won't even explain what that is, but the BOD runoff from a farmyard after milking can be 1,000 or 2,000 milligrams per litre. The BOD runoff of slurry can be 10,000, and from silage effluent, it can be 100,000 milligrams per litre. So those figures are just through the roof. And so when that liquid gets into watercourses, the oxygen levels plummet and you can get a fish kill. But what it shows us is that it's really, really difficult to farm following standard practices in a way that's good for water quality. But what we can do is we can transform our farming practices and move away from liquid infrastructure towards solid infrastructure. What that means in practice is funding research and machinery into compost making rather than into spreading slurry. So the land becomes richer every time you touch it rather than poorer. Because the land is being steadily denuded of plants, it's also being denuded of carbon. It's actually what's going on underneath the grass that's really important for biodiversity, for flooding, droughts, climate change, all of those things. As we strip out the carbon within the soil, it doesn't have the capacity to hold that moisture. Humus can hold 20 times its own weight in water. And so if we lose our humus through spreading nitrogen fertilizer, through ploughing, through heavy machinery, all of those things, then we lose our capacity of the land to hold on to that water. But we can rebuild that again. Whoops. Similarly in our upland areas, I'll just go back one slide here, if I can. In our upland areas, if we strip out the trees in the uplands, which would naturally be there, then again, the upland areas can't hold on to the water when it falls. So you get spates, both flooding and droughts. God, I'm skipping around, lads, so much. This little thing is fiddly. Me and tech, we just don't get on. It's all right. This is Ross Buchanan in Inishowen, and what you're looking at is the leaky log dam. During normal flow, the water flows underneath the logs, and during high flow, it cakes debris up against the logs and slows down the flow a little bit off the upland areas, helping to compensate. In lower land areas, it's much easier. Just widen a drain and dam it up. So you widen it out, dam it at the end, plant it with plants, and Bob's your uncle. You know, you've got a lovely filter wetland that acts as a habitat as well, with a host of native wetland plant species. Wooded buffer zones are also really effective within the landscape, particularly contour hedgerows. A study by farmers in Wales found that there was a 67-fold increase in infiltration into the soil in areas that were fenced from sheep but had trees growing there, as opposed to the area just beside that had grazing and no trees. So if we can have contour hedgerows in the landscape that are fenced off, or contour woodlands, what we can have is a huge increase of water soaking into the soil and helping to protect against droughts and to protect against flooding. So climate breakdown is something that I think can be addressed catchment by catchment. We don't need to worry about the carbon discussions and what's going on when we can look at what's going on underneath our feet. Groundwater, now, it sounds self-evident when you look at it. Groundwater may play a key role in forest fires. If you drain the groundwater year on year in order to grow almonds and avocados in California, once the water table drops below the reach of the roots, you're creating a tinderbox in the forestry, inevitably. Do you know, so forest fires are an absolutely inevitable result of that. And that's an issue of land and water management, not an issue of haggling over carbon budgets. The Amazon basin is drying out at the moment, so the rains getting in from the sea can't reach the interior of the Amazon. And one of the main reasons is nothing to do with carbon per se. If you clear the 200 kilometers or so along by the coast, where the ports are, where it's easy to grow and ship soy meal to Irish farmers, to grow cows on land where we've got perfectly good grass, if you do that, you break the biotic pump. Trees function as a biotic pump. They soak up the water and they evaporate it back into the air. The water can't get from the Atlantic to the interior of the basin in one go. So what they do is they use trees as a biotic pump to pump inland more and more and more. So once you break your pump, then you're kind of snookered. You know, the interior of the Amazon basin has to dry out. And it's doing that at the moment because we're breaking the pump. The plus side of that is that it's really, really easy to turn that around. You reinstate the forest cover that was there. Do you know? So it's very, very straightforward. You just need to pay Brazilian farmers a little bit more to reinstate forest cover rather than to destroy it. So water stored on land stopped recent sea level rise by 22%. So basically that's without reference to putting in practices that store water on the land. I'm pushing it on for time, so I'm going to keep on going. But very briefly, there were storms in 2010 and 2011. The amount of rain that fell on the southern hemisphere and Australia, Southeast Asia and South America dropped global sea levels by 1 full centimetre. That's a lot of water being basically moved from the oceans and dumped onto the land. If we designed our landscapes to hold water more effectively, we could even deal with global sea level rise. And I think the most important one of all, compost, hugely increases the holding capacity of moisture within the soil. If we converted our whole nutrient cycling infrastructure, we wouldn't have farmers chasing their tails trying to keep up with rainfall falling on their yards. And instead what we'd do is we'd transform our soils into biodiverse, really hugely rich havens for wildlife. Because soil is an immensely rich landscape for biodiversity, for the biodiversity that lives there. And it's something that we completely forget. So the tools of landscape rewilding. This is a beaver dam, and we can just bring in beavers. There's a question over whether they were in Ireland in the past or not. That's kind of a moot point. I think another far more appropriate question is, would they work? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Beavers are indigenous to this climate type and the landscape type that we have. And I think beaver dams would be an incredibly rich, diverse way to improve biodiversity, reduce flooding, reduce climate change, sequester carbon, all of those things. And it's not just the beavers. Bison and wolves have a double act going, where the bison try to keep the forest cover clear to create grasslands, and the wolves try to keep the bison clear to recreate the woodlands. So they've got this dance going. And there's lots of other species that play a hugely important role within landscape management generally. Now, we actually have lots and lots of European bison proxies. They're all over the place. We've got lots of those. All we need to do is tweak the agricultural advice so that we train our farmers on how to be wolves. And what wolves do is they keep the livestock on the move. So with regenerative farming, if you know the Alan Savory method for holistic planned grazing, for example, you're moving your animals from dense pens every single day. So you're moving them around from paddock to paddock. And what you're doing in that is you're basically replicating many of the patterns that come with the natural predator-prey dynamic on wild landscapes. And we can shift our carbon budgets from net problematic to net carbon sequestering in our farmlands, even with beef and dairy, if we tweak the way we graze on the land and stop buying beef nuts. Give our cattle grass. We can also get in and we can dig ponds. This is my own pond in a hinch, dug in a day with a digger, and it's an absolute biodiversity magnet. This is a lecture at Oregon State University. Basically what I'm pointing out here is that ponds come in many, many different shapes and forms and types, and just choose the design methodology that works for your particular area. So this is the Limerick Tunnel, the tunnel going under the Limerick City. This was a 60-acre habitat wetland and pond area that we designed a number of years ago. And you can see, oops, a daisy. If this will work, where should I point this? Over there, over to your computer. This is the finished product. This is the Google photograph at the moment. And again, what I want to emphasize here, the main thing that I want to point out, looking at my clock, the main thing that I want to point out here is that the whole area is very, very gently sloping. The more gently sloping it is, the better. Insect species really like the top 10 centimeters of water, so very gentle slopes. So you can see here the edge slope is nice and soft. And this is a quick dip that I did in my own pond. I just threw in a bucket a couple of times and pulled these species out. And there's a whole myriad of species that simply weren't there before I put in the pond. So it's a really, really easy way to have a biodiversity hotspot in your garden, and not just for the aquatic species, but for all the species that come along and enjoy the wildflowers that are around the pond. And finally, I just want to say that we can also, if you have land, great. If you've got a house in an urban area and you can put in a planter, brilliant. If you can work with the tidy towns or the local authorities or with LawPro, fantastic. One of the things that I want to emphasize as well, just as we're leaving it, is that festivals like this, where we've got an abundance of ideas, are really great. I think that possibly the most important journey that we can make as we move towards a world that works is the journey from the head to the heart. Do you know, that's a really, really crucial part of the whole thing. And to really hold on to a vision of a world that we'd be proud to hand over to our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And here, if we can put in riparian woodlands all along our river corridors, suddenly there's habitat space for beavers, there's spaces to walk, get out into nature, there's the potential for filtering runoff coming from the land through the trees, but also there's that capacity to reconnect with the land itself, to have that felt sense that I am an animal in my natural environment. You know, we didn't evolve in square white boxes, you know, that wasn't where we evolved. We evolved amongst green things with interesting shapes. And I think we really need to get out into nature, reconnect, and really move out of this kind of money mind thing and get into our hearts in order to connect and water the seeds of love that are needed in order to make the decisions going forward. And I think that the time is really ripe for that now. I think there's a huge opportunity at the moment to take positive action, to have positive conversations, and to make enormously positive changes and switch it around from being net problematic in our lifestyles to being net beneficial. Humans are turned a hyper-keystone species, such as our impact on the world. And I think that up to now, our role has generally been to make deserts. It's not a particularly constructive role, but that's been what humans seem to have done best all around the world. But the thing is, I think we can completely flip that around and we can begin to replant and rebuild and rewater Eden and grow up the natural world all around us in really exciting ways. And I'm sure there's a point that I was coming to that I've completely forgotten, but it's all really exciting and I love it. And if that thought will come to me in the next 3 seconds, I'll share it with you. There are about, is it 8 billion of us, roughly? Okay. We look at that and we think that's a problem. But the problem is numbers multiplied by lifestyle. So if our lifestyle was to be net regenerative, that could be 8 billion solutions, you know. I can't do this on my own, you know. What Bill Mollison's, and I'll come back to Bill Mollison again, you know, I can't change the world on my own. It'll take at least 3 of us. You know, but with 8 billion of us, can you imagine if we were all focused in the right direction? Simply, if you look at quantum physics and new research in biology and consciousness, simply 8 billion people holding that spirit of love would shift the whole planet in an instant. You know, we've moved into that stage where we're now ready to do that. So I'll hand over and let you take the mic back. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Féidhlim. You might put a bit of passion into it the next time.
I'll try. I'll give it my best shot.
We have a very few minutes if anybody wants to ask a quick question. And put a bit of effort into it, okay? A bit of passion. You can sing the question if you want.
Just wondering, are there many obstacles in relation to compost toilets, in relation to planning permission and that?
Basically, no. There's nothing to stop you from putting in a compost toilet in your house. Where the problem is that if you want to build a house on a greenfield site, then you're going to need to have a site that is suitable for a percolation area, for a septic tank percolation area. And so the problem is not the compost toilets, the problem is the site. And there's a certain merit in the council's decision on that, and that is that if you put in a compost toilet and you're perfectly happy with it, and then you sell your house, the next person may not be perfectly happy with the compost toilet as the only solution for the house. But there's no obstacle at all for just using a compost toilet.
Yep, we have a question down here in the corner. I'm glad I'm wearing my Fitbit today.
Just wondering how big a job it is to convert a conventional percolation area to one that can sustain willow growing on it.
About £2,000. You know, if you can get a machine in easily, I'd put a price of about €2,000 on it. It's a matter of digging up all of the 4-inch piping. Okay, let's assume that you haven't put in your 4-inch piping. So if it's a new house and you've got planning and you've got an EPA permission and all that, it's basically a matter of, instead of putting in your standard 4-inch piping in gravel, dig your trenches. Instead of 4 pipes together, you double the length and halve the width. So you put your 4 pipes 2 and 2, or whatever number you have, and your distribution system in the middle. And the reason for that is you want to string your willows out like a long clothesline. You want the maximum amount of sunshine, the maximum amount of wind movement through them. Into the bottom of your trenches, place either a trench infiltrator unit, which is an expensive kind of modular unit that gives you a soil base and a plastic top, or take a 1-foot corrie pipe, you know, the twin-walled corrie pipes that go in under farm entranceways and the like. Take one of those, cut it down the middle like a gutter with a consaw, and lay those face down on the trench base, and then introduce your liquid into that. So it's really only a matter of changing the piping and changing the layout a little bit. I do have documentation on that. There's an article in Permaculture magazine, and if anybody wants to look up my website and send me an email, I can send you on that article. My website is wetlandsystems.ie. And do send on a request for that article by all means.
Any other questions? No? Okay, everybody. Once again, will you say thank you to Féidhlim?